Great. So, Jane, lovely to have you. I'll just introduce Jane. So we've got Dr. Jane Lugea. She's Senior Lecturer in English Language, specialising in stylistics at Queen's University in Belfast, where she teaches and researches on style in language in everything from metaphors to memes. She's author of World Building in Spanish and English Spoken Narratives, published by Bloomsbury in 2015, and is co-authoring a new stylistics textbook with Brian Walker called Stylistics, Text, Cognition, Corpora, and that's forthcoming with Palgrave. She's just completed an AHRC-funded 18-month project researching how dementia is represented in the minds of characters and readers, and that's the topic of today's seminar. So Jane, take it away whenever you're ready. We're very glad to have you.
Thanks very much, Clara, and it's really lovely to be here. And it's lovely to be there in Chester in person. I've been there before, but I think online has its benefits as well. So hopefully we can have include a wider community of stylisticians by being online. So Clara mentioned the AHRC project that has just come to an end, or at least the funding's come to an end if the work is continuing. And that was the basis, or is the basis of today's talk. However, I'm going to focus on one half of it. So today's talk is on dementia in the minds of fictional characters. That's only one half because, if I move on my slides, because the project as a whole was called Dementia in the Minds of Characters and Readers. Okay, so I spent the first 6 months looking at characters in fictional texts, and those characters had dementia, and I was looking at how it was represented in their minds. And the last 12 months of the project, we did reader response research. We've gathered all the data, but we still are using it. So I don't feel ready to release these results just yet. So I'm going to focus instead on the first 6 months where I analysed dementia in the minds of characters. Just to tell you a little bit about the project overall, as I said, it ran for about 18 months during the pandemic. So it was quite nice to have a lovely research project to focus on, although the pandemic did bring its challenges as well. I was the principal investigator, and I had co-investigators from within Queen's who are cultural gerontologists. And I also had the benefit of working with Carolina Fernandez-Quintanilla, who's a stylistician who specialises in reader response as well. We did a lot of outreach work as part of the festival, and we were lucky to have Jan Carson, who's an author and a community arts programmer. Usually she programs events for the elderly and for people living with dementia, so it was great working with Jan. And then we also worked with two dementia charities, the Dementia NI and the Alzheimer's Society. And our project website is, the URL is there. I can share it in the chat afterwards. And we're also on Twitter. So that's all the information about the project. And I'll give you an overview of our research questions next. So during the time period of the project, we hoped to answer these 3 questions. And today I'm only going to focus on how we answered number 1, but I'll touch at the end on numbers 2 and 3 as well. So number 1 is, how is dementia represented in the mind styles of fictional characters? I realise that mind style is a term that might need defined for some people in the audience. It's an important concept in stylistics, and we'll look at a definition and a redefinition in a moment. So for that stage, for the research question 1, really I'm just analysing the literary texts, and I'll explain how I did that and the results for the bulk of today's talk. Question 2, how can real reader responses inform and develop our analyses of dementia mind styles? In order to do that, we had to do the reader response research, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. And then question 3, how can fictional dementia mind styles promote empathy and understanding of the condition? That is, if they can. So this question was exploring more, how can these this kind of literary language that allows us access to the experience of a character with dementia, what kind of real world effects can that have in readers? And I'll touch a little bit on that with some preliminary results before the end of today. Okay, so we're going to look at question 1. And I did promise you that we would define mind style to begin with. So I've started with the first definition of mind style that we have from Fowler in 1977 when he coined the term. And he described it as any distinctive linguistic presentation of an individual mental self. So it's this idea that an individual has an idiosyncratic or an individual way of thinking, and that can be represented in the language that is attributable to them. The definition is developed a little bit by the next quote, where he describes mind style as cumulatively consistent structural options agreeing in cutting the presented world to one pattern or another, which is quite a nice metaphor, give rise to an impression of a worldview, what I shall call a mind style. Okay. So I've underlined, that's my emphasis, I've underlined two parts there which are quite interesting, because the mind style definition that Fowler provides there has two sides of the coin. So one being the structural options, so the linguistic choices, and the second being the impression, which is held by the reader of a character's worldview or a person in a text's worldview. So there's those two options, and that's something that Semino picks up on many years later when she's writing about mind style. And she's done a lot of research in this area, some of which I'll refer to today. And she says that the term mind style is ambiguous as to whether it refers to linguistic patterns in texts, so the style, or to the characteristics that we, as readers, I suppose she means, attribute to particular fictional minds by interpreting linguistic patterns in texts. So that's an interesting problematization, if you like, of the term mind style and what really does it mean. Okay, so it's got those two sides to it. So is mind style a property of the text, or is it a reader's attribution of a mind to characters? So today I'm going to propose a new updated definition of mind style that I think reconciles the issue. So in an article that I have forthcoming in Lang and Lit, I have redefined mind style as an iconic representation of fictional cognition, offering a simulated experience for readers. So there's 2 points there that I wanted to develop a little bit further. First of all, that mind style uses iconicity, and that's what I think is a defining feature. And secondly, that iconicity offers a simulation for readers to go through that mind style as if they were trying it on, to use Lisa Sunshine's words. So if we think of it as iconic, which is what I'm proposing, let's explore what iconicity is a little bit further. I apologize in advance, it's quite theory heavy at the start here, but then I'll show you lots of examples that will explain some of what I mean. So iconicity is a classic term in linguistics, and it characterizes, or semiotics, it characterizes a relationship of similarity between a linguistic sign and the object that it represents. So there's something similar between the word or the words and the sign that is behind them or that they represent. And Peirce, the semiotician, distinguished between 3 kinds. So the first is imagic, and that entails a perceptible similarity. I think imagic is a little bit misleading because it's not just about a visual similarity, it's a similarity that could be on any of the senses between a visual or the phonic properties of the form and its meaning. So the bird cuckoo is called a cuckoo because it makes that sound. So there's a phonic similarity between the bird and the sign that is used to represent it. Metaphorical iconicity. Now, I say loosely defined here because I really think it's not quite clear, but it's a semantic similarity. She flew down the road in her new car. Well, she didn't really fly. It's a kind of metaphorical, figurative use of flew, but we can get from that there's a semantic similarity between the way that she moved and the flying of birds, fast, almost not touching the ground, etc. It doesn't have to be a metaphor, though. Diagrammatic, then, and this one's slightly more complicated because it entails a similarity in terms of temporal, spatial, or even subjective relations between the reference. So I've given you an example here from my data from the dementia fiction corpus that I created. Now this is Jake, he's a character with dementia, and this is him describing what he sees. Something moves, the dog. Just the way that that sentence is constructed with the something coming first and the dog later describing what the something really was, it shows that the grammatical structure, if you like, reflects the subjective or the viewing position, the knowledge of the character, and that's to do with the relations between the reference. Does that make sense? So it's more of a kind of to do with experience. And in fact, this is what Engqvist in 1981 called experiential iconicity. So Peirce's term diagrammatic and Engqvist's term experiential iconicity really describe the same thing. So it's about linear relations in a text. How do linear relations in a text stand for temporal, causal, spatial, or social relations between reference in the world described by that text? So the relationships between the elements in a text. So that's 3 kinds of iconicity. And I have to say that my proposed redefinition of mind style is not coming out of nowhere. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. I think Louise Nuttall especially and Eric Rundquist have identified experiential iconicity as particularly significant for mind style. I'm just going that little bit further by suggesting that iconicity in general is the defining feature of mind style, including Peirce's 3 kinds. So it's worth acknowledging, you know, that I'm not the first to say this. I'm just pushing it a bit further. Okay, so I give you my redefinition of mind style a few minutes ago, and the first aspect of it was iconicity. The second aspect of it was simulation, and this idea that the reader, when they experience or read iconic forms, they simulate that experience that is represented in the text somehow. So Engqvist already identified a link between iconicity and its effect on the reader, and he described iconicity as a receptor-oriented text strategy. So it does something to the reader that enables them to experience the text in a particular way. And he says, because it reflects the order the reader is supposed to perceive things and act upon his perceptions or her perceptions. So Nuttall as well, in her book on mind style in 2018, recognises that readers' mental simulation of the character's way of thinking is inherent to mind style. So again, these ideas aren't coming out of nowhere. Louise Nuttall and Eric Rundquist have already made some headway in this area. And according to cognitive linguists, Barcelou and Swan, mental stimulation refers to the reenactment of perceptual, motor, and introspective states acquired during interaction with the word, body, and mind. So that kind of reenacting some of these states. And it's particularly pertinent to imaginative discourse, according to Swan. So I'm proposing that the iconic forms are representing the mental experience of a fictional character, and they then allow the reader to mentally simulate that experience. So that's how those 2 things are key in mind style. Okay, so the ambiguity that Semino identified in the traditional definition of mind style is resolved here, because we are explaining both how mind style is a property of the text in iconic forms and an impression that the reader gets through the experience of simulation. So with that little bit of theory, I've given you my end result at the beginning. And now what we're going to do is go back and think about the project, and I'll tell you how I got there. So it's a little bit of the context. What can dementia teach us about mind style? Well, those of you who have studied mind style before might be familiar with the fact that as the years have gone on, scholars have tended to study mind style in characters that have maybe a particular mental illness or medical condition that affects their way of thinking, or at a particular stage of cognitive development, so a child or an earlier form in the human race. It's not all that different or unusual to look at dementia, because we're looking at characters that have an impairment, a condition, which will affect their cognitive and other abilities. But I think dementia has some particular characteristics that are interesting when it comes to mind style. So Abdullah, in her PhD thesis in 2016, and a lot of the work of Semino has looked at autism and autism spectrum disorders as they're represented in fictional characters. But this constitutes the first ever large-scale study of mind styles pertaining to any particular condition, possibly aside from those works on autism. Also, dementia is interesting to look at because it's an umbrella term for a great number of neurodegenerative conditions, which vary in their symptoms and their impact on language use, as well as across individuals. So every person will have their own form of dementia that interacts with their character in particular ways, and also in time, because it's a deteriorative condition. So a lot of the texts that I ended up looking at show a character and their journey, to use the metaphor, from early stages of dementia or pre-dementia right through to much later stages. I'll touch on that in a wee bit and how that kind of influenced and changed the language use. So this is interesting because dementia challenges the consistency necessary for mind styles to emerge. If you think about the definition from Fowler I gave earlier, he talked about mind style cutting the world to a particular cloth. Was that his use of the metaphor? And consistency is necessary. Yet dementia is not going to be consistent. So I was hoping that by analysing a range of characters with the condition, the study explores the similarities and differences in dementia mind styles. I have to give a little bit of a caveat there, though, and the way it worked out, I think in stylistics, we're trained to look for patterns. So the results tend to show similarities, and it's only really, well, especially the corpus results, I have to say, it's only really then through detailed qualitative analysis that you can then see the differences. So the process, I would say as well, so because the reader response side was kind of the second stage of the project, I had to select extracts from a great deal of fiction to use in the reader response research. And it really, really forced me to think about, okay, well, what am I selecting here? What is the linguistic presentation of an individual mental self, if that's what mind style is? How do I find extracts that are really rich in those exact kind of textual features? And also the other side of the coin, what is the reader's potential impression and experience from reading this extract? So I think having to do that, I hadn't really factored that in as part of the project, but having to do that then really helped me develop the redefinition. And thinking about this next question, excuse me, what mind styles can teach us about dementia? Well, why is it worth looking at dementia in fiction? Well, from a societal perspective, dementia is increasingly prevalent as we are an aging society, and there is a need for better cultural understanding and accommodation, as well as social policy. Scholars from a range of disciplines are asking if fictional representations of dementia might facilitate this better understanding of the lived experience. And fictional representations provide us with important vehicles for interrogating the condition as a heterogeneous one. So we know that it's not, because there's so many different types of dementia, which can be acquired at different periods in your life. You don't have to be old. There's definitely early onset. Yet we associate it with aging. There's so many different kinds. Some of them don't even involve memory loss, even though that's a symptom that we associate it with it mostly. So there's a lot of stereotypes and incorrect assumptions. So fiction might be able to help us understand how it's experienced on a personal level and understood in a societal one. There's another really interesting thing about dementia and how it might be put into fiction, and that is that the later experiences of dementia we don't have access to. So someone in the very late stages of dementia will not be capable of writing a novel or a memoir of their experience. Now, there are plenty of memoirs out there of the earlier stages, but what fiction can do is narrativize internal experiences of dementia that are otherwise impossible to access or understand. Of course, there's an ethical dilemma there, which we talked about a lot in the project and in some of the talks that have arisen from the project. but that's something that fiction can provide that really no other genre, I would say, could. So still under analysis, the results of our reader response research will help us answer this question, hopefully. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through the method of how I answered research question 1. How is dementia represented in the mind styles of fictional characters? Well, first of all, I had to select the texts, and I applied these 6 criteria. I wasn't really putting a number limit on it. I was putting this criteria. So first of all, it had to be contemporary because I wanted contemporary understandings of what dementia is. 30, 40 years ago, it was not very well known. Senility, someone senile, would have been the word. And yeah, so contemporary understandings will have changed a lot. 2, it had to be fictional. As I mentioned, there are interesting autobiographies out there, but I was particularly interested in fictional representations. Had to be prose in the English language. And I have to say I included 1 translation from Dutch simply because it's such an amazing example, and we'll look at it a little bit later. But it was set in the US, so it was kind of an Anglophone experience. And number 6, it had to present the cognitive experience of a character with dementia. There's quite a lot of texts out there that show the experience from a carer's perspective or a loved one, but of course with MindStyle you need that access to the internal experience. And this actually made me think quite a lot about, well, how do you get that? So a lot of questions to do with narrative point of view and voice came into this part of the data selection. I used Genet's categories, although it has to be said, we all know how difficult it is to track viewpoint. So I tried to just apply these. Also, I don't think viewpoint and MindStyle have been talked about a lot together. The viewpoint strategies necessary to depict MindStyle haven't really been made explicit in previous research, although Eric Runquist in a 2020 article in Lang and Lit observes that outside of first-person narratives, third-person narratives which adopt free and direct style are amenable to the presentation of MindStyle. I also included the use of psychonarration, which is a term from Cohn, and describes the kind of narrative attributed to a character, in my case with dementia, and the words are attributable to them even if they would not be capable of using those words in that instant, which is a really interesting kind of paradox. Okay, so that was my criteria. This is what I ended up with, 390,000 words of dementia fiction. And when I call it the dementia fiction corpus, but it is narrative prose attributable to a character with dementia. So all from the viewpoint, first or third person free and direct style, of a character with dementia. And that is 12 texts altogether, some short stories, some are just individual chapters drawn from full novels because the chapters were told from the homodiegetic, so the first person viewpoint of different characters, and only one of the characters had dementia. And we'll see an example of that in a moment as well when we go through the examples. I'm sure you're dying for some examples at this point. I'm getting there, I promise. So first of all, what I'll show you is kind of a brief overview of the results, and then I'll show you how they apply to some examples. So I should mention that I did a qualitative analysis using NVivo, and I also did a quantitative analysis, and I'll show you the results of that in a moment. So for the qualitative analysis, this means using coding categories. And I began with the categories that were features commonly associated with MindStyle in previous studies. So if you have read about MindStyle before, you might be familiar with the term under lexicalization, probably classic now in MindStyle studies. And it basically means when a character lacks a term for something in their environment, and there are ways around it. So they can use a substitute term or circumlocute, which is using several words to try and describe what it is that they want to describe. And what it does is kind of show the limitations of their understanding. Marked transitivity, which Louise Nuttall has talked about quite a lot as well. Marked pragmatic behaviour, which Semino talked about in relation to characters with autism. Metaphor, so unusual uses of metaphor that relate to how characters see the world in terms of labelling objects and people. And Simon Zupan has talked about how body parts can be used metonymically, and this has got to do with agency and transitivity as well. So a hand is responsible for carrying out an action, for example, rather than the person who owns the hand. Dan McIntyre has identified illogical reasoning in a character in the lady with a van as one of her mind style practices. So I had actually found all of these, which is interesting. And then Chloe Harrison has talked about world switch triggers, drawing on text world theory. She looks at Elizabeth is Missing, which is one of the texts that I then included in my study because the lead character has dementia. So with world switch triggers, it's to do with something in the present environment might trigger a memory, and then the character is brought back to the past through analepsis, flashback, and then something from the present draws her back in, but there's a blend of reference across the two worlds. So that was also significant in my study. So I began with those features, but then I added relevant features as they arose, and I categorized them under the above headings. There's a full list of coding categories available. Believe it or not, it was much longer than this. So I had language peculiarities, some of the ones that you've already seen. And then on top of that, marked given and new information. You can imagine that if a character has a memory difficulties, what would be new for a character is already given for the reader because we remember it. Marked tense, repetition. Under figurative language, I also found a lot of euphemism, humour and negation. Personhood, I took the name of this overarching category from dementia studies itself because there's a big issue in dementia studies around the agency and the person behind the person who has dementia, because dementia is seen as something that affects your cognition so much. And as we know in Western society, thinking is deemed so important over many other aspects of our life as humans, maybe over emotions and relationships and other non-rational ways of being. So personhood was quite important for this, and there's a couple of interesting categories there, including physical sensations, which were very important in the data. Cognitive functions, in addition to illogical reasoning, I added some memory difficulties, sensory descriptions. Again, a lot of the narratives were in the present tense and just described everything that was around them and their senses, rather than relying on memory. And then narrative level features. So things like dramatic irony and references to other discourses. I'll show you some examples of those to make that clear. Okay, so that was the qualitative analysis. Then I did a quantitative analysis as well using corpora. So I had 390,000 words of dementia fiction, and if I want to find out what's interesting about it or what's characteristic of it, the best way to do that is to compare it to a reference corpus of general fiction, contemporary fiction. So I compared it to the BNC fiction subcorpus, which is 14 million words. I went through a lot of instructions that were in Jeffries and Walker 2018 and a couple of other, Dan McIntyre and Brian's Corpus Stylistics book, which is really useful for anyone who wants to do this kind of thing. So I'll show you the results here. So these are positive keywords. That means words that occurred with more statistical frequency in my data when compared with fiction in general. And I grouped these keywords according to themes that emerged. So as you can see, body parts, really important. That relates to the metonymy that I mentioned earlier. Physical descriptions, which relates to characters describing people by their physical descriptions, maybe rather than their names, if they've forgotten names. Sensations, again, the immediate environment is more important than what happened yesterday. Words to do with time and age. Under specific terms, so talking about the girl rather than using her name. Words to do with language, so reflecting on language and how it works or what it means. Doubt, and emotions as well, which are unfortunately on that list, they're kind of very negative. And there's a longer list. That's just the short one. Okay, some examples at last. I did promise you some. Okay, the first one that we're going to look at is from a novel called An Absent Mind. Now this one, I have to say, what you have in front of you is actually not the character with dementia, it's his wife. So the way this novel works is that each chapter is told from the perspective of a different character. It's Saul that has dementia and his wife is Monique. It's as his dementia progresses and he goes into a home, his chapters get shorter. We get less from him, but this chapter is from Monique, and then I'm going to change the slide and it's like turning the page, and the next chapter is from Saul's perspective. So Monique, day 668, my Saul. Joey, Florence and I went down to visit Saul today. Then he looked at me. I mean, really looked at me. It was as if we were connecting once again, just like when we first met. I don't believe it lasted for more than a minute, if that, but it was truly magic. I don't remember if he said anything besides when he called me chauffeur. That stunned me. Other than nonsensical chatter, he hasn't uttered a word in over a year. It was as if he felt this might be the last time we would ever see each other. And you know, I think it was so powerful for both of us that even if it were the last time, what a wonderful way for me to remember him. Turn the page, and this is the next chapter. So, day 668, I saw her. Just her as pretty Chauffeur. So Chauffeur was his pet name for her. And we know all this because earlier on his chapter contributions are much fuller. So I have to say this is something that you didn't really see very much in the data that I looked at. But what we've got here is, as you can see, a complete breakdown in language, and it's represented iconically using imagic iconicity to represent the cognitive difficulties in that Saul is experiencing right now, and that's through typographical and orthographical deviations. But it also emphasizes the emotional and affective connection that remains with his wife, doesn't it? I think you'll agree. This is French Canada, so that's why he calls her in a French term. Well, it's not even a term of endearment. I think it means cauliflower, but it is between them. So this example also challenges the assumption that mind style can only arise from consistent lexicogrammatical patterns. And I think it lends some weight. I don't know if you've read Alan Palmer's Fictional Minds, and I don't agree with a lot of what he says in there, but he does say that the cues to fictional minds might be in a much broader range of features. And I think you can see that here, because in this case, there's an intertextual interaction of another character's observations, so his Monique's observations, and then Saul's minimal contributions. And between the two of them, we get a sense of Saul's mind style. So I do think there's something there that might support some of what Alan Palmer has to say. And I should point out as well that, as I've said already, you don't get much of this in the data simply because it's a bit of a paradox. How do you narrativize the experience of dementia and show a breakdown in cognitive and language abilities using language? It's kind of hard. So some of the texts did use this, where as we went on, there was more deviation, more formal deviation, and that was an imagic iconicity to represent the cognitive and language breakdown. But obviously, for reasons of trying to make sense to a reader, there wasn't that much of it. So there's other ways of representing dementia in the minds of characters. In this example, I'm going to talk about under lexicalization, as well as some pragmatic difficulties, and what I spotted a lot of, this kind of dramatic irony, where the reader is privy to more information than some of the characters. So this is from Elizabeth is Missing. And in this section, Maud is the character with dementia who's narrating. and she is in her home, and the doctor has just been on a home visit, and her daughter Helen is there as well. So the doctor is he. He is already inserting the little plugs, the wire shells, back into his ears while he talks on to Helen, and I wonder briefly what it is he listens to. I cup my hands over my own ears, straining to hear the sea-like music of my circulation, the singing of my blood. But hands don't work as well as shells. They don't create the right echo or whatever it is. Helen comes back after letting the doctor out and sits on the arm of my chair. You didn't have to cover your ears, Mum, she said. He wasn't shouting. So as I've mentioned already, you can see here there's full sentences. So perhaps because the lexicon in people with dementia is more sensitive than syntax, stylistic deviations are much more commonplace at the lexical level in the data. Also, it makes the prose easier to read. And as such, a classic hallmark of mind style under lexicalization, it has renewed significance in this study where it is evident in every character. So what we see sometimes is circumlocution, where a character works around not having the word for it, but also they use under-specific terms, which the keyword analysis showed, and words like thing, thingies, something, girl, etc. And another lexicalization strategy is the use of substitute words, which we can see through the qualitative analysis. So in this particular scene here, Maud has difficulty naming the doctor's earbuds, and she draws on her existing schematic knowledge of shells. And later on in the book, we find out she had a great love of shells and collected them as a child, which what shells do is, of course, they approximate the earbud shape and their use as a listening device, like we play in childhood games. So in this extract, the conception of one concept, earbuds, in terms of another, shells, it's a metaphorical process developed into an extended metaphor where the bodily sounds are music and singing. And I think this extract is quite typical of the data, whereby long-term memories provide the characters with dementia with source domains, to use the term from conceptual metaphor theory, to conceptualize and process stimuli in the present, engaging in metaphorical iconicity. So because narrative prose can supply those memories, the characters' past memories, through flashbacks and give access to the character's use of long-term memory to process the present, readers are often given a better understanding of the character's behaviour than the other characters in the scene. And I think you can see that happening here, where the daughter Helen doesn't understand why Maud has her hands over her ears, and in fact misunderstands it, when us as readers, we do, because we have access to all that information. So I think that's quite important for thinking about simulation and readers' responses in the next stage of the research. Okay, example 3. We have 5 examples and then we're pretty much finished, just with some final slides. So here in example 3, I'm going to talk about things like euphemism, which was important, illogical reasoning, and pragmatic success, because it's not all bad news. Sometimes there are characters who show us ways of interacting that can be helpful, and I think this is one of them. So in this scene, May, who has, well, it's quite a complicated story. One chapter from this novel is told from the point of view of May, who has dementia. And in this scene, she's chatting with a girl. And it's the girl who speaks first. He's in there, she said. The man in the suit? He's not in a suit, not as far as I know, the girl said. Oh, well, I'm not dead yet then. You said it, the girl said. So May is the character with dementia who said, well, I'm not dead yet then. And you might have noticed it's quite difficult to follow her line of reasoning here. So there's no man in a suit means I'm not dead. As a reader of this whole chapter, you eventually figure out that May has a superstition that when a man in a suit comes, that's her time to die. So she keeps on looking for a man in a suit, and everyone that she meets who's a man, she expects them to be wearing a suit. So that just explains a little bit of the context. Also, I would point out, notice that the girl is used to identify the other character. Again, she doesn't have a name. It's another under specific terms, and it explains the statistical overuse of specific terms such as girl, woman, thing. Interesting that they're all female, actually. Another kind of figurative language found in the data often was euphemism, although that was, here's one of the differences I promised I would point out. It tends to be employed by some characters more than others. Interestingly, euphemism adds to the underspecificity of language, I think, and it emphasizes the cultural taboos constraining the character with dementia and how they verbalize their experience. So bodily functions, sex, death, and May, this character, refers to death frequently, as I said, and looks for signs in it. So at the level of character interaction, May seems to be engaging in what McIntyre called illogical reasoning. The premises, the man not wearing a suit, do not provide reasonable grounds for the conclusion, I am not dead. The girl may be confused by this. I suppose it's an infringement of Gricean maxims, but she doesn't reveal her confusion to May and somehow manages to maintain social and pragmatic harmony, which is what I've called a pragmatic success here. And because we as readers have access to May's thoughts and superstitions, the reader holds the background information necessary to understand the relationship between May's premise and her seemingly illogical conclusion. So that is, we can simulate the diagrammatic relations between the reference in her logic and their metaphorical iconicity. So there's two kinds of iconicity happening there, diagrammatic or experiential, as Enquist called it, and metaphorical. Okay, so two more extracts. Will I go through these? Yeah, because this is sensory experience. So this is quite important. So in this scene, Maud is walking into a police station. Okay, you have to know Maud walks into the police station regularly and forgets that she's done it before. In this case, I think she's forgotten where she is. But I can't see anything to tell me why I'm here. Hello, Mrs. Horsham, a voice says. I look up. There's a desk on the other side of the room with a sign saying, Police Reception. I read it aloud. So although Maud forgets why she's visiting the local police station, the reader at this point in the novel will know it is a repeat behaviour, and it adds to that kind of dramatic irony where the reader remembers more this time than the character with dementia. Sometimes we know more than the other characters, but here it's the character with dementia. The fact she visits the station often also explains why the unidentified police officer behind the voice can greet her by name, if you notice, Mrs. Horsham. And Maud notes the lack of visual cues to help her orient herself. And in an instance of diagrammatic and experiential iconicity, the greeting, hello, Mrs. Horsham, is represented according to her experience of it. It interrupts her thoughts as unattributed direct speech. So this reflects Maud's confusion about its source. It's attributed to a disembodied voice, and it's left to the reader to infer the speaker. And this kind of exemplifies another trend found in the data, whereby characters report events and actions all around them, leaving interpretation as to their significance or connection up to the reader. So in a way, the effect is similar to the diminished sense of cause and effect realized by the transitivity patterns in other mind style studies, I would say. So looking for visual cues, as you'll see here, to orient herself, Maud finds them in the signage, police reception, capitalized in an instance of imagic iconicity, and reads it aloud, which is something she does quite a lot to the annoyance of her daughter. So we've got access to Maud's sensory experience, and it facilitates a deeper level of understanding in the reader towards the experience of dementia and the behaviours that arise as a result of the symptoms, I would say as well. Okay, that was it for the examples. They took me longer than I thought. So I'm just going back to the research questions. Hopefully I've answered question 1 for you pretty fully. If you want to know more, there's an article coming out on that. We're still analysing the data to answer question 2, and I'm going to look at question 3 because I do have some results that can answer that question for you. Okay. So the second stage of our research project involved hosting reading groups. We did it with 4 separate groups: student social workers who had were interested in working with dementia in a professional capacity later. B, the general public. No specific link to dementia, but of course many people were affected by it in some way. C, carers for people living with dementia. And D, people living with dementia also formed a reading group to tell us what they thought of the fictional representations. They had a slightly different purpose, so we weren't assessing the impact of the fiction on their awareness and understanding. Obviously, they already had lived experience to draw on. We just wanted to know how that lived experience was reflected in the fiction, if at all. There were 6 or 7 participants in each group, plus a researcher stroke facilitator, and each group met on Zoom once a week for 6 weeks in May last year. So just coming out of lockdowns. And this is how the reading groups worked, our data collection for them. We did a pre-study questionnaire, and then we did the same questionnaire after the study. So the idea there was to ascertain if there was any change to their empathic disposition, so their potential to be empathetic as people. I have to tell you now, it didn't change that. Okay, so we didn't make people more empathetic. That's okay. That was a big ask. But I will show you some results from that were immediately kind of visible from the data that we collected. And then what's in the middle of that diagram there, the weekly reading questionnaires, extracts that they marked up as we went along, and then the recorded discussions, that generated so much data. That's why we can't answer those questions yet, because we're still working through it. It was a lot of data, more than I think we bargained for. So what I can give you today is just a quick comparison of the pre and post answers to see if we can begin to answer question 3. How can fictional dementia mind styles promote empathy and understanding of the condition? So we asked participants not living with dementia, so the other 3 groups, to answer these questions or to suggest how much they agreed with these questions. I understand what it might be like to live with dementia. I can imagine what it might feel like to experience symptoms of dementia, and I feel I know a lot about dementia. And as you can see, comparing pre-test average and post-test average, they all went up. So the 6-week experience really impacted then on people's understanding and their capacity to imagine or know about dementia. So that's interesting. After the reading groups, we asked them, for you, have the reading groups impacted on any of the following? And we asked them to select all that apply. 58.8% said yes, awareness of dementia. 88.2% said yes, understanding of dementia. And 52.9% said your behaviour in situations involving dementia. And interestingly, 70.6% said their reading practices were impacted. So I'm going to just finish up now. Hopefully that wasn't too long. Sorry, Clara. With some conclusions. Mind style can be redefined, I think, as an iconic representation of cognition, such that readers are invited to simulate the particular way of thinking endowed in the text. The proposed clarification emphasises the role of textual features in simulating the cognitive experience of the narrator or character, and it also implicitly recognises the effect upon the reader, which is to share in that experience. 2 sides of the coin. Rundquist in 2014 suggested that narrative fiction allows readers to access thoughts and other facets of consciousness. Interesting that consciousness is not just thoughts, that do not take linguistic form at all, and it can represent these phenomena with language. I think that trying on minds, as Lisa Sunshine puts it, it's not simply an aesthetic exercise, but it is a significant way in which literature conveys meaning, probes humanity, stretches the limits of readers' experience and our understanding of other people's experience, even if that is a fictional representation. I think did I miss my last one? No. Okay, so that's just it. Thanks to my project team. I have to say the anonymous reviewers at Lang & Lit really helped me hone these ideas. Clara for inviting me and everyone else for listening for so long. Thank you, and questions.